Ravi, by the way, is a very, very big believer in the Harappa habit framework. Do you want to tell us why you really subscribe to this one?
So, when I think of the challenges that today's youngsters are facing in terms of choosing which courses or which professions to go after, it's not easy, right? With all this technology that's changing, we don't know whether some professions will even be around 5, 10 years from now. If I'm studying auditing or accounting, I don't know if I'll need an auditor or an accountant 10 years from now. I don't know if the programming language I'm learning will be relevant. So it's in a lot of flux. But if you look at some of these foundational fundamental habits, as you call them, these are eternal and these will remain in vogue, in importance, come what may. So it doesn't matter which sector you go into, which geography you go into, which function you're in, you will need these 5 habits. You will need to think better, solve better, communicate better, collaborate, and lead better. So I love the fact that you guys are focused on this.
We're really going to focus on three basic principles: Minto's pyramid principle, Aristotle's appeals, and hero's journey. All sounding very old fashioned, Ravi. Are they really sort of relevant even today?
Old is gold, Seema. Old is gold. It's fabulous.
Okay,
Some of these are really old, but they are so useful.
great. And we're definitely going to have many, many questions from you. We hope your question list is ready. Eventually, Ravi will share his reading list and then we'll take it further from there. All right. So before we begin, let me explain what the communicate habit really means to Harappa. It's one of those habits, and this is interesting that, when I came in, I'm a former journalist. When I came in, I was like, oh, do people really need to know how to read, write, communicate in all these different ways? I thought this is a skill we are all taught as children. But the Harappa communicate habit really, really breaks it down, and it really helps you to get skills for which you don't really need, you don't really need a fantastic vocabulary all the time or a real great accent or other things like that to be able to speak effectively, to be able to write in a structure or in a way that it helps other people understand what is the message you're really trying to give. We also have something called listening actively. This is a very, very interesting skill because a lot of us, we think we are listening, but what we're really doing is hearing. What's the difference between the two? How do you manage to sort of, make yourself a better listener and therefore a better sort of, person, a better employee, a better spouse, husband, communicator, any of those things. And finally, this was a habit that we've recently, a skill we've recently taken out, which was called reading deeply. A lot of people think that reading is associated with, with novels or books and other things like that. But in the workplace, more of us are reading more and more information. There's so much out there. How are you able to read all of that? How do you sort of synthesize the messages that are important for you? How do you, sort of get through all of this? And it's not just about reading text, it's about situations, it's about reading people, it's about reading many other things in your environment. We finally wrap off the communicate habit with something called building presence. Use all the 4 skills and make yourself the best or the most effective communicator. So that's how Harappa looks at the communicate habit. So Ravi, why do you think that communicate is going to be a really, really critical habit? What does it really mean? Why is everybody talking about that? Don't we all communicate all the time?
We do, Seema, and it's always been important. But I think there are a couple of really big changes that are happening now that are making this more important. And by the way, when I say changes now, I don't mean COVID-19 because that's a clear aberration now. But if you look at how the world has been changing since the last decade or so, what is happening is that we are seeing a ton of data explosion in sector after sector after sector. And I have a saying that I use that if data is a new oil, then storytelling, which is a nicer word for communication, is the new refinery. You can't just dump data at your audience. You need to refine it using some of the communication principles so that it becomes easier for them to consume. So that's one change, data explosion. The second change is the fact that with all these devices and notifications and apps, and there's so much distraction around us, which means that our attention spans are actually falling. They were never very high to begin with. So with these two challenges, you need, it's more important than ever to be able to communicate clearly. And so for helping our audience to do that, we have focused on these three critical frameworks. The best way to understand these frameworks, Seema, is through a good real life case study, which is what we have picked
Sure.
up. Would you like to go and shall we introduce the case study now?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so there's a very interesting case study because it's very pertinent. It's done by one of the most respected business leaders on the planet. And when you read it, you're like, oh my God, if only. Yeah, so it's very interesting. So this was a 2015 TED Talk by Bill Gates, where some of you might have seen this. It was sent in an email to you. Some of you might have read the transcript. For the others, I'll just quickly summarize, right? So essentially, he's saying two things in this TED Talk. One, he's saying that the greatest threat to humanity is not nuclear war, is not war. It used to be that maybe a few decades ago. Now, the greatest threat to humanity is, surprise, surprise, pandemics. Right? So it's crazy, and he talks about how pandemics can be really far more devastating than the ones that we have had in the past. Talk about being prescient, right? But while the talk is incredibly, well organized, what I really like about the talk is that he's used many of these story principles very, very deliberately. And one interesting thing about Bill Gates is that he's not naturally a very charismatic presenter. And that's one myth that I want to bust across everybody, right? So don't worry if you feel that you're not a natural storyteller. Nobody is a natural born storyteller. I was extremely shy as a kid. I used to.
Also, everybody doesn't have, has to have that vocabulary, or has to have that, sort of accent, or has to have that command on language always to be able to tell their story, right? Would you
Absolutely.
with that?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so preparation is the key. And if you're able to prepare to tell your story well, then you'll do great. You don't need to have any of this. You don't need to be a natural communicator, right? So that's one great thing that I really liked about it, and the fact that he's used these storytelling tools. So let's start with the first one. The first one, which is, if you pull up the screen, you look at the first tool that we're going to be looking at today, which is the pyramid principle. And so the pyramid principle is a very interesting, very powerful technique. And in order to explain that, I'm not going to actually talk about the concept, but I'm actually going to use a couple of examples, relatable, everyday examples. So let's start with the first one, which is a simple email, looks simple, which is sent by an assistant to his or her boss. Do you want to have a crack reading it?
There's a problem with your hotel booking for the conference in Hyderabad. I could only book Tuesday, Wednesday night. The hotel is already full on Monday night. I tried several others, but there's nothing to be had anywhere because of the electronics fare. I haven't tried yet. According to the airline timetable, there's a flight on Tuesday morning at 9. Arrival time in Hyderabad is 10:30 local time, as conferences begin at midday, and the journey from the airport will take about an hour. You will arrive on time. The office has booked a seat for you already, just in case. By the way, isn't it your wedding anniversary on Monday? What? What are they asking?
I'm surprised you read through it entirely, Seema. I thought you'd give up.
Yeah, I'm
Wait,
like, where did you pull that out?
this is bad, right?
Is this person asking about hotel booking? Is
Yeah.
it flight tickets? Is it anniversary? Is it a fare? I just can't get what is it?
It's all over the place, right? It's completely confused. But let's be honest, we have all seen such emails. We have received such emails, and let's be honest, we may have sent a few such emails, right? So what happens
Ouch.
here is that we sometimes tend to dump all our thoughts without any structure onto directly the email, without taking a crucial step in between. That step in between is to convert your thoughts into, put your thoughts down on paper and organize them in a certain way. Good. I think most of the audience is actually getting what is the key message that the person is trying to tell, right? So this person, Deepak, was originally planning to travel on Monday and reach in the evening on Monday so that the conference, when it happens on Tuesday, he's on time. Unfortunately, this person realized that no, there are no hotels available on Monday. Then obviously she'll worry about whether he'll be on time on Tuesday. He will be, because it starts only on midday. And then she also remembers that, oh, it was his anniversary on Monday. So So those are the reasons, but the net final takeaway or the one-line summary is, if you can go to the next slide, please. This is the one-line summary that you need to travel on Tuesday morning instead of Monday night. And I'm glad many of you cracked that, got it, so which is very good. So that's the one-line summary. That is what should be there in your subject line instead of urgent plus important. What does that even mean? Yeah, so this is does a lot of help to the reader. Communication should be something that is easy for the reader to understand. He should not have to plod through the whole thing and try to figure out, hey, what is it that you're trying to say? Yeah, so that's something that this does. And you then organize your supporting arguments to support that at the bottom. And now, Seema, let me tell you a little small story of how this framework came about, right? So,
Tell us.
1960s, McKinsey and Company, one of the world's leading consulting companies, hires its first women MBA. It's a lady called
Barbara Minto.
Yep, yeah, that's Barbara Minto. And so Barbara Minto was very, very good at writing, at communication. And they figured out that, if you give her an existing deck or a report, she's able to, turn it around and make it far more clearer and crisper and easier to understand. And so when she was editing a lot of the reports sent by some of her other colleagues, she realized that again and again and again, she was reorganizing the ideas in a particular shape. And guys, you want to guess what that shape is? I'm opening it out
To us.
What was that geometrical shape that she realized? The pyramid, absolutely, Dharini. So clearly we gave away the hint earlier, but yeah. So that's the pyramid principle. And this is what she christened as the Minto pyramid principle, which came out as a book at that time. And it's simple but extremely powerful. And all it says is that the structure of all effective communication, and we'll come back to the all, is a pyramid of logically related ideas. And that seems quite straightforward. And what it basically, if you break it down, it says that you need to have one single main point that encompasses the entire argument, the entire report, presentation, email, whatever. And then that is supported further by next level supports, which are further supported by next level arguments. And kind of, it goes down like a cascade. Interestingly, yesterday we talked about a powerful tool for problem solving. Can somebody remember what was that tool? How do you break down a problem? I don't know how many of you issue tree. Yeah, this is. Can you guys see how this is similar to issue tree? You start with the one main point, and then you break it down further, and it branches out like an issue tree. So think of the pyramid as an issue tree, but for communication, not for problem solving. Yeah, so it's extremely powerful. Yeah, so the reason why I find it's extremely useful is that it can be used for all communication, all work communication, by the way. Bill Gates used this framework.
So you're going to decode Bill Gates' 2015 TED Talk on the basis of the pyramid principle for us now.
Absolutely, Seema. Yeah, and you'll find that it's there underlying in it. It's not like clearly. Obviously, he's not going to be organizing ideas in the form of a pyramid, but the underlying skeletal structure is there. So if you look at the one-line main message that Mr. Gates is saying, can we have that, please? So this is the main message that one, pandemics are our most important threat, and we need to invest in a strong response now. Okay, so to support that, he had the next level points, and I could see 5 next level points that he had. And so if you can have the whole screen coming up, please, so that we can just run through this. So I'd like folks who are watching the screen to look at the next level and read it like a story, just the yellow boxes, right? The yellow border boxes. So the first point he's making is it's pandemics, not war, which is the biggest threat to humanity. The next point he's making is that Ebola, which recently happened, was worrisome, but it was not as bad as it could have been. The next epidemic could be far more lethal. Words ring so true, right? Anyways, and then he says that you can cope if we build a system that is better equipped to respond. And then he talks about what that system will entail, what are some of the initiatives that need to be done by governments, companies, etc. Finally, he answers the question that people may ask, hey, but how much will it cost, Mr. Gates? We have the money to do it. He says it doesn't matter what it costs because the benefit that we might get from it is enormous. Because imagine what we are losing now. Thousands of lives, probably millions that might be lost, trillions of dollars of economic output that's getting lost. So that's the power of preparation that could have hopefully we should have listened to it, but anyways. So that's the situation that unfortunately we were in, which you did not listen to. But the key point that I liked here was how this argument that he made was organized so very logically. This was a concept that was put forth not 10, 20, 30, 40, 100, 200 years ago, but 2,300 years ago by this Greek philosopher called Aristotle. And this guy was seriously a rock star. I mean, the kind of output that he brought out that we're still using today is incredible. But this framework of LEP, or Logos, Ethos, Pathos, was probably his greatest hit. And what is Logos, Ethos, Pathos? It basically means that whenever you're trying to persuade somebody in communication, you need to have a mix. Now, it doesn't say an equal mix or 50% logos, or numbers are not there, but a mix or a blend of three elements, which is logos, ethos, and pathos. So the logos refers to the underlying logic, the data, the science behind the arguments. The ethos refers to the credibility of the speaker or the sources of information used by the speaker. And the pathos is the emotional content of the message. And a good way to think of these is to try and see what are the questions that are being answered by each of these three, right? So logos is basically answering the question that, hey, what do you want me to think or understand at the end of what you're telling me? So it's all appealing to thought, understanding, logic, left brain. Pathos is asking the question, what do you want me to feel after you have told me something? What is the emotion that you want to evoke in the audience's mind? So it appeals more to the right brain. Ethos is like an underlying, basic thing that we're always asking. Can I trust you? How do I know what you're saying is true? Because can I trust you as a person? Can I trust the sources that you're using? Trust is like at the foundation of everything, right? So all of these three are incredibly important. Trust is almost like a binary. If you don't have trust, then even if you have great logic and great emotions, it won't work. So ethos, I would kind of break it into two parts, right? Two ways in which you can use ethos. One is your own ethos as a person, and a simple way to talk about it as take the case of the US, right? So in the US, you've got people who might be huge Trump supporters, for whom Donald Trump has great ethos. It doesn't matter if he says something which may be logically wrong, which may be emotionally manipulative. It doesn't matter because for them, he's so high in their ethos scale that they believe whatever he says. On the other hand, there might be people who are non-Trump supporters for whom the ethos is so low. Even if he says something which is logical or which is emotionally right, they will not believe him. So ethos kind of goes typically with the person. And if you kind of take it to us, like, ignore senior politicians and leaders on an everyday basis, I kind of like to think of ethos as a small bank account that you have with every person. And with every transaction with a person, you're building up your ethos. So if you tell somebody that, hey, I'll send you that report by tomorrow morning, and by tomorrow morning you actually send it, then you have built up your ethos. If you don't send it, then that person slowly thinks, hey, next time I should be a little more careful. That guy, he lost some of my trust. So every time, every small transaction we keep building, we are, adding to that, depositing into that bank. And therefore, many times when we go back and ask somebody a favor, somebody who we know very well, the reason why they agree, even sometimes without knowing facts or data or emotion, is because we have very high ethos for them. And so the second way of building ethos, sometimes let's say you're young and you're new in the company, you might not have that experience to have built a huge, strong bank of ethos. What can you do then? What you can do is borrow ethos. You can borrow ethos from people who are credible. So make sure in your research, you cite credible sources, you cite credible people. People, again, now who are credible? You'll have to again look at the receiver. Who are you presenting to? If the person you're presenting to does not have a very high opinion of, let's say, Mr. A, then you probably don't want to use Mr. A's point as a credible point. So you'll have to
Okay.
try and figure out my audience, who is it that they respect and look up to, and we try and use those sources. Logos is the logic, and we saw the way Gates had organized the thoughts using the pyramid principle. So nobody will have a problem into saying that, this is not logical. This is extremely logical. Clear flow, supporting data, everything backed up. So there's no issue with logos. Guys, we know you can't see the screen, but we're just explaining it. The screen is coming up very soon. The second point, which is ethos. Now, in ethos, it's not so much about the content, as I mentioned, but about the speaker. And in this case, Gates has very high ethos. Why? Not because he's a great business magnate, one of the richest guys in the world, the guy who founded Microsoft. All of those are not really the source of his ethos here. The source of his ethos here is the fact that he is a leader in the public health sphere. With the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, those guys have done a lot of good work in that space. They've spent millions, if not billions, of dollars in public health, and which gives him the ethos to talk about it. So that's one source of his ethos. The other source that he refers to are the sources that he takes. So when he talks about, for example, what's going to be the hit on the global economy, he doesn't pull out a number from the hat. He says the World Bank estimates that we're going to see some trillions of dollars of damage to the global economy, right? So those are credible sources which kind of add to the ethos. Let's talk about pathos. And this is one interesting thing, right? You would not expect a guy like Bill Gates, to be very emotional on stage. And he's not really being emotional, but he is including or sprinkling the right elements of emotions to evoke those emotions in the audience. So let's see what are some of the things that he does. So if you look at he starts with a great personal story. And for those of you who have not seen this talk, I'd really urge you to go and see it. He starts with the story of when he was young, they used to have a barrel that they used to store rations in when in fear of a nuclear war. And that's a nice story that makes him relatable, that that's something that he did when he was young. And to a lot of people in the audience, this is the US, right? So many of them would have done something similar, would have had something similar. It evokes feelings of nostalgia. It evokes feelings of thinking, hey, he's one of us, he's something similar. So that's a great way to build that connect using pathos. The other point that he uses in pathos is the visuals. He uses some really evocative visuals that was really simple and powerful to evoke those emotions. Visuals are really powerful when you're trying to evoke emotions. And the third thing is emotion inducing words. So he uses words like dramatically devastating or heroic work. We were just lucky. And all of those are kind of, giving, ticking those emotion boxes in your mind. So it's all very, very deliberate. He also infuses some interesting humor with a Hollywood reference. So it's very, very well done in terms of, adding these elements. Yeah, perfect. So this is a framework known as the hero's journey. And what is this about? This is a literature prof called Joseph Campbell, who studied mythologies across the globe. He was, active in the 1940s, 50s. And when he studied the mythologies across, Greek, Norse, Hindu, etc., he came across a stunning realization that, all these stories have like a common underlying structure. And he called that structure as the hero's journey. And it's fascinating. And he came out with a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces in 1949. But the point of the hero's journey is that you need to, at least from a business point of view, is that when you're pitching to somebody else, when you're pitching an idea to somebody else, you have to stop thinking of yourself, your idea, your solution, everything as the hero. So it's a bit of a trick question. The real answer is none of the above. So who or what is the hero? It is the client. It's the client or the customer whose problem you're trying to solve. And all these elements that you're trying to build, the analysis, the idea, the technology, blah, 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 all of those are critical elements, but they are supporting actors. The real hero is always the client. Yeah, so you need to kind of, so that's a key point or key takeaway from the hero's journey, that you have to look at the client as a hero and look at the problem of the client as a journey that they are undertaking. So SCQR is essentially the stages in the client's journey broken down into a simpler business framework. So S stands for the situation or the context before the change. When things were all hunky-dory, there was no need to change. Typically in a movie or a story, this is the once upon a time part of the story. C is the complication or the change that happens in the life of the hero or the client, the external event that disturbs the status quo. In a movie plot, it might be the fact that, oh, you suddenly know that you come to know that aliens are going to attack Earth. Or in a movie like PK, for example, right? Amir Khan lands on Earth and somebody takes away his device and runs away, right? So that is the
So
complication.
is COVID a complication in most businesses' life cycle
Absolutely.
today?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So let me
Is
actually
that
take that as an example,
okay?
right? So let's take that because it's a better example. So let's take the situation for most businesses, which is a situation before the change, is that this is a client, let's say a large consulting organization, which is running a lot of face-to-face training programs for its employees. That's the status quo. That's the situation. Complication, COVID. You can't run any face-to-face programs. So now, before we come to the resolution, there is a question. The question is, how does the client cope? So the way the question might be worded for the client would be, how do I still achieve my learning objectives in this new situation while balancing the trinity of quality, cost, and time? So that's a key question. Now, what might be a resolution? Maybe enroll for Harappa courses. Yeah.
Thank
So,
you.
so that's how an SCQR story will go, where you say that this was a situation, this was a complication. Because of that, now there's a problem. The question is usually the wording of the problem, the definition of the problem that we again talked about yesterday, and the resolution is the solution that you're proposing to make it work. Now, this is a very simplified version of the hero's journey, SCQR, right? So real life has a little more nuances, a little more complications. So when I personally looked at it, I wanted to add some layers and nuances. So I built a framework, a more detailed version of this called the 7Cs framework, which I've blogged about. And we don't have time to go into that. But what I thought I'll do is to try and quickly apply the SCQR detailed framework to our case study to see how Bill Gates has used this to try and organize his thinking in that TED talk. So can we go up to that slide? Wonderful. Right. So what we have here are the points that he's making and the order of SCQR that's coming, right? So the context that he's setting is that, guys, earlier the situation was war was our biggest threat. We used to have barrels filled with supplies in case of a nuclear war. That situation is gone. The world has changed. What is the change? The change is that it's a far more globalized world. We have enough deterrents for nuclear action, but the problem is we don't have a system in place for a big pandemic, and that's the biggest worry or threat that we have. So our question or the key complication is what will happen if there is a big devastating pandemic? How do we prepare ourselves? And his resolution or his solution or answer, I call it the conclusion, is that we need to do da 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 da. So he's kind of giving all these prescriptions. All his prescriptions are basically a part of the resolution. He says we need to be preparing like the army does. Governments need to do this. Public enterprises need to do that, and so on. So there are a bunch of prescriptions. Now he says all of that, and there's a far more detail there. And then he tops that up with a couple of more points, and which is all the nuance in the framework. So one point that he makes is, what is the benefit that we'll get at the end of all of this? What is the cost benefit thing? And he makes that very clearly when he says that the benefits will far outweigh the costs. And in the hero's journey, when you're describing the future good scenario, when you're asking the hero to change, that's sometimes called as a promised land. It's a very, very classic term that comes from the world of filmmaking and script writing. So that's a promised land that he's telling us that, imagine if we are, better prepared, we won't lose millions of lives. We will not lose trillions of dollars of economic output. But that is if we do all of those things. So he had a call to action at the end, which was his last point. Unfortunately, it was not heeded. But anyway, so that's it's just history. But that's a great example of one talk in which he uses the pyramid principle as a skeletal structure. He infuses it with the right ethos and the right emotion, and he makes sure that that it goes through the journey of the context, the change, and how we need to change and do things differently. So it's powerful, right? I just thought it was a great case study to look at all of these.
We'll take some questions now. Another one, a lot of people did ask us about that weightage question, which I also asked you. Should the weightage of logos, ethos, pathos depend on the audience that you're speaking to? And is that what decides how you balance it?
I think, yeah, the audience will be one of the biggest factors. Audience kind of overrules pretty much everything in storytelling. So the audience will be one of the key factors. I think another factor will be the type of content that you're giving, right? So are you trying to sell me a tube of toothpaste? In which case, I probably don't need 10, 15 slides of information. Or are you trying to convince somebody to invest in a 400 crore factory? In which case, I can't just make it like a 30-second infomercial. I need a lot of backup data. So depending upon the type of content that you're trying to communicate, some of these elements will definitely change.
Okay, another question. Somebody says, I'm a very emotional person. How can I use this as a strength while communicating?
So I think emotions are useful, but sometimes we tend to get carried away with our emotions. And It's important to kind of acknowledge the emotion that we're going through. Try to, express that in a way that does not make the audience feel uncomfortable. That's one challenge, right? Sometimes there are many people who may not be as emotional, and seeing a very strong display of emotion makes them uncomfortable. So you need to try, and maybe a couple of rehearsals, dry runs, so to speak, beforehand will help you to maybe get out the excess emotion, and then maybe in a more regulated and calibrated way, don't ignore those emotions, don't hide them, but maybe do not do an over the top rendition also.
This was, I think, one of the first questions which we missed. It basically asks us, why is it said that people often don't listen?
So I think many reasons, and a long answer for that is I'm going to recommend a great book on listening called You're Not Listening, by Kate Murphy, I think. Yeah. So it's called You're Not Listening. It's a recent book, and lots of reasons that people talk about why people don't listen. And in my own case, I'll tell you, one of the barriers to listening, and I'm sure many of us go through, when we are hearing someone talking about something, our mind is constantly having a dialogue with itself, and either trying to refute what you're trying to say, or trying to come up with responses, maybe trying to come up with clever put me downs, or trying to say, what are the 5 ways in which you're wrong, or whatever, right? And when you're trying to respond even before listening, that means you stop listening. And so that's one of the barriers, and I realized I was doing that in some cases, so I needed to kind of stop. It's okay if you don't respond immediately. Take your time, hear out the person, listen to the person completely, take your time, organize your thoughts, and then get back. But there are many more barriers to listening, I think.
Okay, can you talk a little about reading deeply? Is there something that you would like to take? Should I take that?
So why don't you go ahead, Seema? And I do have some thoughts, but
No, no, why don't you say? I'm reading so many other these things.
So what I do in terms of reading better is I use my Kindle, and I mark out passages using the highlight feature of Kindle. And I don't do it as often as I should, but the great feature in Kindle and Amazon Kindle is that you can go back and read your highlights. So I go back and do that. And so I
So
think
in
that,
the reading deeply course, we do talk about the fact that reading should not just it's. I mean, since we're talking about business reading, we also mentioned that one thing that helps is taking notes while you're reading, or marking out something. And the other thing is always understanding the purpose of reading a particular document. Why have you been asked to read this? If that is clear in your mind, you will be able to synthesize and take out the information that you really need, or you will look for that information when you're reading. So those are some techniques that you can use, because a lot of us get a lot of stuff to read, and often we don't have that much of time. So that's what we do. Yeah, I think I've just said somebody talked about how their company doesn't believe in PPTs and they give you lengthy documents. So I would recommend you do try the course. And as I said, one of the things that really helps when you sit down to read something, and this I say not just as somebody who's been reading, but also as an editor, I always make sure that I know what is the purpose of this communication, who is this audience to, for whom, or why am I reading this, and eventually what is the result that I have to deliver as a result of this reading. And that's how I start reading, especially bigger documents. This is specifically documents for work and not for pleasure reading. That's one thing. The other thing I always do is, I know Ravi mentioned Kindle, but if it's a very important document, I tend to take a printout and read on paper rather than read only on this thing. It helps me a great deal. Yeah, so these are the three principles we really shared with you today. Barbara's Minto's pyramid principle, Aristotle's appeals, and the SCQR framework. Let's have a look at Ravi's reading list, please. Yeah. Okay. So Ravi, any one of these is a special favorite?
yeah, Seema. So for me, the best book of the lot that really influenced me the most is the second one, which is Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath. And it's a really simple, easy to read book, but filled with insightful recommendations on how you can become a more persuasive communicator, how you can make your messages stick in the minds of the audience. So I would recommend that, number one. The pyramid principle is very powerful, but it's a tough read. But I would still recommend it. Yeah. So all the others are also great.